Hello everyone, I'm Steve Mitchell again with the Mind of Watercolor YouTube channel, and we're going to talk in this video about blending and layering with watercolor pencil. And we're going to talk about how to do it and considerations and options when you're doing it. Let's get started. Alright, so usually one of the questions that comes up a lot with watercolor pencil is how do you mix them? How do you mix a color? Because you're going to obviously want a color that is not a particular pencil. Although I will mention that the Albrecht Dürer range includes 120 colors. If you want to buy the whole range, that would give you a little more variety in terms of mixing. But still, a lot of times you want just a subtle variation of a color, maybe to neutralize the color, because a lot of the colors that are in the range are fairly vibrant, and you just want to neutralize them and make them a little more of a neutral gray. Just assuming that we want to mix, what do we do? Well, first let's talk about putting down the color as a mix to begin with. I strongly recommend that with any watercolor pencil set, you create a swatch chart. So you'll know exactly how the pencil looks, and it's helpful to do it on the paper that you're painting on. This is similar, it's not the same paper, but just basically a good watercolor paper like what you're using. And you can see once it's activated what it looks like. You can also see, and I usually will draw a line above and beside, you can see what it looks like before it's activated. And I will usually activate it to the extent where not all the pencil has been activated. So I see it basically in any way that it'll go down. But watercolor pencil can, to a certain extent, be a little unpredictable. It always activates much more intensely and darkly than what the pencil goes down as. So if you have a chart like this, it gives you a handy reference while you're painting or drawing. Now you can do mixing right on the paper as you put it down. So for instance, let's say I want to blend this green and this sort of blue-gray. And you can get a bit of an idea from the blend, from the pencil visual, of what the color is going to look like. You won't completely know till it's activated, but I'm going to completely activate this with water so that the pencil strokes are almost completely gone. And we'll see each color on the ends here before it was blended. So that's a way of blending. Requires a little bit of guesswork, but a lot of times that's sufficient. If you just want to be in the ballpark and you know you're going to be in the ballpark, you can blend that way with watercolor pencil. You're essentially putting it down the way you would from a normal watercolor paint palette and letting it blend. Now, by far my favorite way is layering. And let's say we put this green down, that has dried, but we say, you know, that green is way too intense. I want something that's a little more neutral, but a green cast. So let's use the same pencil that we blended with over here, only let's blend it in a layer. In fact, let's shade it so that it's darker with that color towards the bottom. Now you have a lot more control mixing this way. Okay. Now I've got a nice shaded blend. I'm not going to make my brush too terribly wet. Just enough to activate that color and get it to its full darkness. And I've had a lot more control about not only where the colors blended, but how the value blended. This is a watercolor piece that I did completely in that technique. This is all watercolor pencil. There was no standard watercolor used in this at all. This was all watercolor pencil. And I did the entire thing using that layering technique, with the exception of the background. In the background, I did mixing in this fashion where I put down pencil and mixed it dry with the pencils. And that was okay for the background because this was all going to be very washy very loose. But where these flowers were modeled and where the values were modeled, and there was probably 4 different shades of pink and red in here. I just had all the control that I wanted by layering them gradually. There's a video on my YouTube channel showing how I did this entire flower. And not only that, but the pencil's just made for excellent linear and fine details in these leaves. And it just gave me a lot of options. And you can glaze, and that's what that's called primarily in watercolor. The thin transparent layers are usually called glazes. You can layer to your heart's content. Now, of course, if you know watercolor at all, you know that each layer you add makes it darker. But just a lot of really good options. I want to go with yet a value darker for some parts of this tree. And I can easily add another layer. Wherever that pencil was, I can activate it in any way I see fit. Just a little bit, a lot. I can pull that wash out where I want it. And my little cartoon tree there is starting to take shape. I'm going to get some rays of sunshine on these, on this lit side here. I can do that. You can blot it to lift it if you think you got too much color. Just the way you can with regular watercolor. Go back in and again, detail to your heart's content. Watercolor is basically a light to dark medium, meaning you start with your lightest tones and build and work down into the dark tones. And watercolor pencil is no different in the way you activate it and layer it. And I just want to touch from the last video, we talked about the blending, whether it's a very wet blend or just a slight dry brush blend. Okay, how do I want to blend that? A very wet blend is going to turn that into one gigantic solid mix, pretty much a solid shape. But let's say I like the blend and I've kind of modeled it carefully with my pencil, and I want to maintain that modeling or where those colors are. So I'm going to rinse out my brush, but I'm just going to clean it off so it's only barely damp. And I'm going to damp blend these colors together. And you can adjust if you feel like your brush is still too wet, blot it off. I'm getting a blending of those colors, but the initial laydown has not changed. The initial blend of when I laid it down has not changed. And you can do any degree of blending in between. That's sort of the point I'm trying to make. How much you blend these colors or activate them is up to you. There's not like one set way of blending them. A lot of people think with watercolor paint or watercolor pencil, you have to activate the whole thing and just turn it into paint. All paint. You do not. It's really fun to experiment with and see how the different forms of blending and layering, and there are just myriad ways in which you could combine the blending and the layering. It's really fun to experiment with that. In the next video, we'll talk about some special effects and some neat ways in which you can use watercolor pencil that are a little out of the ordinary.